sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix, and trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then of course the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town, Monday to Friday 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
this is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
down to earth,
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
and most importantly, honest,
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Isabel Webster. Thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, I'm Tom Harwood, bringing you the State of the Nation tonight. The future of UK energy security has been thrown into doubt as the Supreme Court rules drilling sites can't be approved without taking into account the environmental impact of how that oil is used down the line. But what does this mean for your energy bills? And the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has vowed to bring an end to the gender wage gap once and for all. But is there more to the gap than meets the eye? And is Labour's manifesto more radical than we first thought? Within it contains the duty on public bodies to reduce inequality. But how might skiving lawyers or conniving lawyers leap up upon this duty to stop pro-growth policies? Plus, as two candidates and a policeman are under investigation for election gambling, we'll be taking a closer look at these final days of Rome-like developments. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my panel throughout, GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the journalist and Conservative peer Paul Goodman. That's all to come up after your very latest headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Tom, thank you. Good evening to you. Well, as four main political parties go head-to-head tonight in another election TV special, Michael Gove has been saying today the Tories are still capable of pulling off what he's described as a poll-defying election victory, despite forecasts of a Labour landslide. New YouGov data suggests the Conservatives will slump to their lowest number of seats ever, while Labour could win a 200-seat advantage. It's also predicting significant gains for the Liberal Democrats, winning 67 seats. That's 6 times their result gained in 2019. Well, in other political news today, Conservative candidate Laura Saunders, who's facing a probe over allegedly betting on the timing of the election, says she'll be cooperating with the Gambling Commission investigation. Laura Saunders and her husband, Tony Lee, who's the campaign director for the Conservative Party, are both under scrutiny over the allegations. A solicitor for Mrs Saunders said this afternoon she's also considering legal action against the BBC and other outlets for infringements of her privacy rights. That comes after another Tory candidate, Craig Williams, admitted to an error of judgment after placing a bet on when the election would take place. Government Minister Michael Gove says the allegations are reprehensible.
It is the case that obviously any decision by anyone to use inside information to bet on the election date, that is wrong, deeply regrettable, but I think the individuals concerned are now being investigated, and until that process is concluded, I think it's difficult for me to say more.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer criticised the Conservatives for this, saying that behaviour would never be tolerated by Labour.
This candidate should be suspended, and it's very telling that Rishi Sunak has not already done that. If it was one of my candidates, they'd be gone and their feet would not have touched the floor.
Sir Keir Starmer. The economy and the Bank of England has held its interest rate at 5.25%. That's the highest level since 2008. Bad news for borrowers, but good news for savers. The bank says it needs more certainty that inflation will remain low. But minutes from the Bank of England's meeting hint at the possibility of a rate cut in August when they next meet again. News coming through to us this evening that the actor Donald Sutherland, whose career spanned more than 7 decades, has died at the age of 88. His many film credits included The Dirty Dozen in 1967, the war comedy MASH in 1970 and Ordinary People in 1980, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Most recently, he starred in the Hunger Games series of films. He was, of course, the father of Kiefer Sutherland, who announced his father's death on X today. He's often cited as one of the finest actors never to have won an Oscar. He did, however, win 2 Golden Globes and an Emmy. Donald Sutherland, who's died today. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts. Scan that QR code on your screen right now, or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I'm Tom Harwood. The sight and sound of the demolition of a Scottish oil rig. While this decommissioned North Sea rig had reached the end of its useful life, is this a scene we're to see far more often in the years to come? Today marks what some are calling a serious shift for the future of UK energy security. For the past half-decade, campaigners have fought Surrey County Council through the courts against their decision to allow the expansion of an oil well back in 2019. Well, today the Supreme Court has ruled in their favour that planning permission for new fossil fuel extraction cannot be granted without taking into account the use of final oil products far down the chain. In short, construction has to take into account of far more than the environmental impact of the site itself. Until today, the entire industry worked on the assumption that emissions from constructing the wells, rather than the use of the final products, should be considered in their planning assessments. But this landmark case today changes that and has serious implications for the future of oil and gas drilling in the UK. The complainant, Sarah Finch, spoke to the press outside the court and said other energy projects may now fall thanks to this ruling.
It's going to make it a lot harder for anyone to open a new oil or coal, whatever field, and it has implications for some that have already been agreed but are under subject to legal challenges, such as the coal mine in Cumbria, the giant Rosebank oil field in the North Sea, the Jackdaw field, and not forgetting our sister site, Biscathorpe in Lincolnshire.
Well, UK Oil and Gas plc have today said they'll now ensure that future production will fall below the levels at which environmental assessment is required, limiting production, limiting revenue, limiting growth. And because the law on environmental assessments is based on EU law, this ruling could have impacts on the wider continent as well. Well, goodness me, let's digest this now with the usual host of this programme, the former Business and Energy Secretary, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, thank you for joining me and welcome back to your usual time slot. This is a pretty profound ruling today.
It's a very unfortunate ruling. It seems to me to be a very political ruling. It's interesting that the lower courts, the High Court and the Court of Appeal, didn't take this route. They didn't think you should take this into account. And I'm deeply concerned that the Supreme Court is trying to make energy policy rather than simply interpret what planning law is meant to say, and therefore has deviated from what everyone thought the law was before. And this could potentially constrain our ability to use our own resources. It won't reduce global emissions. It will simply mean other countries make the money, not the United Kingdom.
And yet these lawyers have found this ruling and argued this ruling within the words of UK statute, within the Climate Change Act. Is it right to be blaming the lawyers and the courts and the judges? Or rather, should the fault, if it is a fault, or perhaps some people will argue this is a very good thing, isn't it to do with the legislation that MPs have passed?
Well, I think if you look at how this judgment has come about, it's a 3-2 ruling in the Supreme Court. So it's a very narrow margin in the Supreme Court when the Appeal Court and the High Court found in the other direction. I am concerned that you see the courts, and we saw this over the small boats, becoming increasingly political. So this is the Baroness Haleisation of the Supreme Court, and it fascinates me that since she's resumed her seat in the House of Lords, she constantly, when she bothered to turn up to vote, voted against the government, that there is a left-wingery, I fear, that is abroad amongst the judiciary, and this is moving now into the climate area and can potentially make people cold and poor, which seems to me highly undesirable.
It does seem that there are, no doubt, activist lawyers and indeed activists who brought this case to drag it through the legal system. But haven't politicians like yourself given them fertile ground with which to play? Indeed, the Climate Change Act is what this is based upon. And the government, the UK government and Parliament nodded through the net zero commitments in the dying days of Theresa May's administration.
Well, the Climate Change Act was passed when the Labour Party was in office, and I hadn't been elected to Parliament at that point. I think Gordon Brown was Prime Minister at that point, and I wasn't MP. So I can't take the blame for the Climate Change Act, but I think it's really important that we revisit the commitments we've made on the Climate Change Act. Other countries aren't doing this. We're 1% of global emissions, and we are making this nation poorer, trying to achieve something that without other countries doing it simply won't happen. And this judgment is in its way fatuous, because it won't change emissions. It will merely change the ease of us using our own resources. Other countries will still exploit their resources, whilst we'll find it harder to use ours. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. And I think it is a pity that the Supreme Court decided to move away from the earlier and lower courts.
Now, when you were Business and Energy Secretary, did you see many of these issues cross your desk? How involved are the politicians who run these departments in keeping abreast of all of this action? Because it seems whenever anyone tries to, for example, open a new coking coal mine or a new oil well or whatever it is, there is just legal action after legal action after legal action.
That's a very fair point, and I was very keen to ensure that more licences were given in the North Sea, and we worked very carefully to make sure that was done in a way that wasn't subject to legal challenge. There was an incinerator plant that I would have liked to have given approval for, but I wasn't allowed to because of the risk of judicial review, mainly dependent upon the common seal. And the thing about the common seal is it's common, and it wasn't going to be at very great risk. But nonetheless, we have got ourselves in a situation where ministerial discretion is consistently being undermined, and I think ultimately you want democratic, accountable control. Now, you're right to say a lot of the problem with this is in the legislation, and I would be keen to see a change in legislation so that we can exploit our own resources more. We need to ensure the United Kingdom is competitive. That's the way we're going to improve the standard of living, the condition of the British people, that they can be more prosperous.
Well, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you so much for returning to this time slot, and it's really, really good to see you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Well, with me now in the studio is the campaigner for Defend Our Juries, Tim Crosland. Tim, you've taken some of this action in the past. Why is it that so often activists are using legal avenues rather than political avenues?
Well, because we have the rule of law in this country, and one of the laws that we have is before a major project is undertaken, we make sure we understand what the impact is going to be. We make sure we understand what the impact is going to be on those Surrey residents whose homes have been flooded this year, on the Surrey farmers whose crops have been destroyed this year by flooding. That is the law, and when you're digging up oil, it makes sense to understand the impacts of burning that oil. That is the only thing the Supreme Court has judged today, that to pretend when you're drilling for oil, the burning of that oil is irrelevant would be a fantasy. It would be to undermine democracy. It would be to deliberately blind ourselves and bury our heads in the sand.
This is what was argued in front of the Supreme Court justices. It was a split decision.
It was 3-2.
So some of those justices said that actually the burning of this oil, does that have a direct impact on the residents of Surrey? Does it really? I mean, the amount of oil that would have ever came out of this well, it's immaterial to the amount of climate change that's going on.
Well, if it was immaterial, why didn't they assess it? They didn't assess it.
Because the industry standard was to assess the impact of the project, the construction of the project, rather than any end state down the chain effect of burning oil or doing whatever it is with making plastic with the oil, whatever it is. That had never been thought to be assessed. And it does seem to some people that what happens here is that activists decide they don't want this to happen, and then line by line go through to find any chink in the armour of these impact assessments that are hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages long. I mean, it does look like it's lawfare.
I think that's a very cynical perspective. I think there's a much more democratic perspective on this, which is before major corporations with vast resources behind them and vast propaganda teams and PR firms, before they undertake a project that we think is likely to have impacts on the resources we all depend on, our land, our air, our water, our crops, we understand what the impact is going to be. And those lobbyists and those lawyers, I mean, just imagine who's got the bigger teams of lawyers here. Is it the Exxons and the BPs, or is it the tiny little activist groups?
Well,
those lawyers
activist groups are fairly well funded these days.
Not compared to big oil, believe me, not compared to big oil. And so it's those lawyers who have worked to get us into a very counterintuitive position where we don't assess the impacts of burning the oil, which is the whole point of drilling for the oil.
Now, of course, you've worked for the government in the past. You have been there at COP26 and been part of that drive to get more clean energy delivered. Are you not worried that exactly the same tactics that are being used now against oil and gas are also being used by some green campaigners against solar farms, against wind farms, and against nuclear power? Three things that are vital in the energy transition. There are currently green campaigners who are using environmental impact assessments in much the same way that they were used in this case to stop new offshore wind farms because they might damage fish and they might damage birds. Are you not worried you've opened a Pandora's box here?
I think understanding the implications of what we do has got to be a good thing for democracy.
At the cost of clean green energy?
Whether apply this same principle to green energy, it's understanding the impacts of the wind farm, understanding the impacts of the nuclear energy, and assuming we can live with those impacts, the project proceeds. Applying that principle to those other cases.
These projects now come with thousands of pages of regulation, of red tape, of green impact assessments. Spain has, in the last couple of years, decided to do away with the same intense level of environmental impact assessments for green projects. Why does it make sense to have this level for green projects, that they must meet the same sort of environmental impact assessment requirements? This is lawfare, this is red tape, and it's tying up our own domestic energy production.
Well, this only kicks in where a project is likely to have a significant impact on the environment. If it doesn't, and the judgment is it isn't going to have that impact, then it shouldn't face this kind of procedure. And that's what the Supreme Court has said today. The only thing we're discussing here is the Supreme Court saying, let's stop pretending that the point of this drilling of oil isn't to burn the oil. And if the point is to burn the oil, let's look at what the consequences of that's going to be for the residents of Surrey, who only this year have had their homes flooded, their farms flooded. Surrey County Council just earlier this year put out a call to residents of Surrey saying, we have £5,000 compensation for your funding.
They might well want some of the 75% windfall tax revenue on oil and gas to perhaps build some flood defences. But Tim Crossland, really do appreciate your time. We've got to get to a break, but coming up next, Rachel Reeves has vowed to end the gender pay gap once and for all. But if you're wondering what Anne Widdecombe has to say about that all, you might want to stick around.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Almost half of those seeking to have an affair are happier with their job than with their primary relationship. But what exactly does a cheater do for a living?
Well, medical assistants and nurses, surprisingly, top the lists of professions for female cheaters, and it's jobs in IT or tech for male cheaters, which I think is less of a surprise.
No.
This is all according to a survey by the dating site Ashley Madison.
OK, so why do people cheat? To answer this, we're joined now by broadcaster and psychotherapist Lucy Beresford. Good morning, Lucy.
Morning, Lucy.
So, is it OK of me to say naughty nurses in this day and age? Am I going to get cancelled for that?
You're out.
Yeah, I'm out.
Been cancelled.
See ya.
There's the door.
But yes, you're talking about the caring professions, and I think it's very appropriate.
Surprised by that.
Women, well, because they're very nurturing, very loving, very giving, whereas the males who are in tech and IT, very strategic.
Is there a link between high-pressure jobs, maybe nurses infamously, you know, they're working long hours, underpaid, stressed out? Is there a link between jobs of that nature and cheating, maybe as a relief?
Absolutely. Is it just about sex, or is it about emotional connection? Is it about emotional validation? And increasingly, people are discovering that their primary relationship is just not a place where they feel safe.
This survey found that personality didn't actually come into it that much. It was about half and half if you're an introvert or an extrovert that you'd be likely to have an affair.
I think that's right. And I think that just speaks to the fact that all people want to have a good emotional connection. So it doesn't matter whether you're really social or whether you're someone who has to recharge your batteries in private time, that actually we only ever want three things in life. We want to feel safe, we want to feel loved, but we also want to feel heard. And in increasingly a number of marriages and long-term relationships, we get into grooves, we get into ruts, and we stop hearing our partner, we stop listening to them, and they stop listening to us.
The People's Channel. Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Okwir, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled. Lovely.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation at 8:21. My name's Tom Harwood. Now, in an interview with The Guardian today, Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has disclosed she would close the gender pay gap once and for all. Claiming she would use the Treasury to empower the position of women in society, she said she would shatter the last glass ceiling in politics. But is the gender pay gap what Rachel Reeves would have you believe it is? It's true to say that endemically women are being paid less than men for the same job. Is that really true? Well, to take a look at the UK pay gap data, this is it broken down by age. You'll see virtually non-existent up until the age of 40, at which point women are paid substantially differently to men. Virtually no pay gap at all up to the age of 39, and then a pretty profound one. Is this due to a sudden onset of misogyny hitting when a woman reaches the age of 40? Or could there perhaps be another explanation? What this graph does not, of course, take into account is the time that women and men may have taken out of work earlier in their careers. Yes, it tends to be the case that women choose to take a considerable amount of time out of their jobs in their 30s, returning in their 40s. Perhaps we should stop referring to this as a gender pay gap and instead start talking about the motherhood pay gap. Well, joining me now to try and answer some of these questions is the former Conservative Minister, now Reform Party Immigration and Justice spokesman, Anne Widdecombe. Anne, thank you for joining me. It looks like you're a little bit blurry. Let's see if we can sort that image out. But firstly, your thoughts on what Rachel Reeves is trying to say in this interview with The Guardian.
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, first of all, it is already unlawful to discriminate against somebody in pay purely on the grounds of their sex. If you've got two people literally doing the same job, I mean, desks side by side in an office, literally doing the same job. You cannot pay on a differential basis. But you have hit the nail on the head, because when you look at it more generically, and you look at the statistics across all age groups in the nation, then it is quite obvious that women do suffer slightly. And the reason for that is because they haven't always worked as long as men, and therefore they haven't qualified for the higher pay. I mean, it is normally the woman, not always, sometimes it's the man, but it's normally the woman who takes the time out to raise children. And if a household has decided that they're going to do it, if you like, the traditional way, and the woman is going to take time out, then she will be behind when she rejoins the labour market. So it is just a nonsense, and I'm not exactly sure what Rachel Reeves has in mind, and she should be pressed on it, because I can't answer for what's in her head.
Could it not be the case that some employers are misogynistic? Some employers might hide behind the idea of older women having taken more time away from work. We don't have the particular data to hand, but it could be the case that using these group associations, there is some discrimination going on in the workplace today.
As I say, it is already unlawful. I mean, completely unlawful. If you've got two genuinely the same jobs to pay at differential rates, doesn't matter what the person's sex is, what their age is, or anything else is, you cannot pay at different rates. That is already unlawful, and it doesn't need any further action. What you then have, of course, is this thing called comparability. So you have to somehow compare the person at the till, the cashier in the supermarket, with the person heaving the boxes in the warehouse. And of course, that's completely unmeasurable. And people cry foul when the one gets a higher rate than the other. And they say, oh, well, it's mainly men in the warehouse and mainly women on the tills, and, therefore there's a gender pay gap. But that's rubbish. It's to do with the job itself.
And yet that is the legislation that was brought in by Barbara Castle all those years ago. Just finally, of course, it is Birmingham City Council that has bankrupted itself off the back of mismanagement over differentiated pay between jobs that are mainly done by men and mainly done by women. Of course, it was a Labour council at the time that it made all of those mistakes. Should Rachel Reeves perhaps be turning her eye towards that council?
Oh, well, I mean, you only have to look at Labour administrations everywhere. I mean, Birmingham's a very good example, but if you look at the mess that Labour's made in Wales, I would not trust Labour to administer, a child's pocket money. I really wouldn't. So the idea that Rachel Reeves is going to suddenly have all women totally equal to men, regardless of these problems of definitions of comparability, regardless of the fact that women have taken time out, and haven't therefore moved as fast up the career ladder as the men who stayed in have, regardless of all of that, Rachel Reeves is going to bring the gender pay gap to an end. Oh, dear, spare me.
Well, it will be a measurable thing to see if she does or not. And thank you very much, Anne Widdecombe. Really appreciate your time. Now, the Tories have decided to paint Labour as the party rolling out the red carpet for illegal migrants. Let's have a look at their latest advert. Now, some might say this is all rather brave of the Conservative Party. After all, large-scale channel crossings began on that party's watch, and they're yet to stop the boats or indeed get a single plane off the ground to Rwanda. But perhaps the Tories do have a point. Would the numbers become even bigger under Labour? Or maybe the weather has a bigger impact than any politician? Well, joining me now is my panel, journalist and Conservative peer Lord Goodman and GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. Nigel, we're going to start with you. It's very brave of the Conservatives to put out an advert in the year or the 2 years since Rishi Sunak's pledge, 40,000 people across the channel in small boat crossings.
Yeah, it certainly is. They've got a real nerve to put this one out. Yeah, and there's 882 came across on Tuesday. That was the highest so far this year. So the Tories have hardly got a great record on dealing with this. I mean, we're not going to stop the boats. I think we have to start from that point. Whether it's Labour or the Conservatives, the boats are going to carry on. What we've got to do is come up with the right sort of policy to deal with it. Rwanda was the wrong one, far too much money. It was never going to be value for money, even if it deterred a few people. Labour's plan at the moment looks to me like the better bet, because they're talking about beefing up border security. What they should be able to do is tackle the smuggling gangs using terrorist tactics.
And yet, doesn't this sort of get to the very sort of a visceral feeling in politics? Because people sort of have an idea of Britain, of Britannia, as being the country that once ruled the waves. And now we can't even rule the Channel.
No, and Brexit was meant to actually cure all this, and of course it didn't. I mean, I think that we still have to get back to the fundamental problem. If you can only claim asylum on British soil, that will be a draw for people to come across from Calais. Once you find a system whereby you could claim asylum offshore, elsewhere, that would stop the draw.
I suppose, Lord Goodman, is that not one of the fundamental problems? The treaties that we're signed up to encourage this sort of stuff.
Well, look, the fundamental problem, I suppose, with the advert is that very few people at the moment seem, sadly, to be wanting to listen to what my party's saying in the election. But if you step back a bit and you kind of think about the issues as a whole, I think it's a very, very serious situation, because insofar as I understand Labour's policy, it's kind of like the old saying that the original bits are not good and the good bits are not original. Quite a lot of what they're proposing, the government's doing already. So what's actually going to stop the flow, if anything? And I think you're onto something when you say that the international agreements that we've signed, that everyone else honours, the Refugee Convention, all the rest of it, they were all formed in a world 50 or 70 years ago. They're just out of date. And I'm puzzled by why a British politician of either party hasn't said that they're going to try and lead some sort of diplomatic international effort to make them more realistic and more attuned to the times we live in.
Yeah, it's strange, because, Nigel, once upon a time there was a Prime Minister called Tony Blair who once said he wanted to reform the 1951 Convention on Refugees. Never got anywhere, though.
No, it didn't. And we're stuck with the issue of international law. So at the moment the big battle is over whether we leave the European Court of Human Rights or just simply ignore it. I think the more likely thing, if Rishi Sunak was re-elected, is we'd ignore any of their decisions and then see what happened after that. But I still think that as a country, we don't want to go down the route of Belarus and Russia. We want to stay within the international community.
But of course, it's not just the ECHR that is the issue there, it's the United Nations. But, Paul, there is, of course, we've been talking about the Conservative policy, the Labour Party policy. There is a maverick, extra party that has sort of begun to rear its head in the last couple of weeks, and that's the Reform Party, that's saying that they'd simply turn back the boats.
This doesn't sound very realistic to me. I don't think Reform's policy platform is designed to do anything other than garner public sympathy, because everyone knows they're not going to win the election, so they're not going to have to implement any of these difficult ideas. No, I think the future is in renegotiating the agreements. And actually, funnily enough, I suspect kind of 5-10 years, other European countries will be doing offshore or Rwanda-type schemes. Rishi Sunak's problem is he's just got there too early.
Interesting stuff. Well, we've much more to discuss, of course. Thank you for now to my panel. The Labour Party has pledged to give public bodies a legal duty to reduce inequality. Will it actually reduce inequality, or simply lead to unelected bureaucrats stunting growth and overruling our politicians? Or both? Find out after the break.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office on GB News. Most places will have a fine start tomorrow. Plenty of sunshine, but a change on the way in the west as things start to cloud over with outbreaks of rain, courtesy of a couple of weather systems and a couple of areas of low pressure, pushing away the high pressure that's brought most of us a fine day today. Still very pleasant out there this evening. The main exception to that being Western Scotland, as the rain is trickling in here. Some of that rain could turn a bit heavy as we go through the night, but for most it's a dry night. Clear skies will allow a little bit of mist and fog to form and turn quite chilly over parts of eastern England, down to single figures for parts of East Anglia and the southeast, certainly in the countryside. So a coolish start here, but any mist and fog will soon disappear, and then generally it's going to be another fine day across the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast. Plenty of sunshine, soon starting to lift the temperatures, but a cloudier day for Wales and southwest England. Quite a cloudy start for Northern Ireland with some outbreaks of rain here, and a bit of a damp start in western Scotland as well. Much of northern England, much of eastern Scotland dry and fine, but a lot of cloud and some outbreaks of rain and drizzle over the Northern Isles too. It's further west though, where we've got this weather front moving in, bringing more in the way of persistent rain. That'll cloud things over across all of Northern Ireland by lunchtime, and patchy rain edging in here through the afternoon. Further rain to come at times across western Scotland. A few showers developing across Wales and southwest England too. Still some brightness possible here, but definitely the brightest, sunniest weather over central and eastern parts, and the warmest weather as well, 23, 24, whereas in the west it will feel a bit cooler than today because of the cloud and the rain. Leaving some showers around during Saturday over parts of eastern England. Another weather front coming into the northwest, but between, again, many places set fair on Saturday, a brighter day for Wales, and as we go through the weekend into the early part of next week in particular, it is going to get quite a bit warmer.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes, she could have said stump.
You made my argument for me.
What
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
It went everywhere.
Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates.
You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it? Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation at 8:35. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has presented himself as a quiet, middle-of-the-road centrist. Yet in recent days, attention has been drawn to just how radical some of Labour's constitutional changes may be. Parliamentary reform, rolling back of trade union democratic accountability, and even the highest tax burden ever are all right there in the Labour manifesto. As is a further proposal, to give public bodies a legal duty to reduce inequality. Not to make people better off, but to reduce the gap between rich and poor. Let's have a look at what Margaret Thatcher once had to say about such ideas back in 1990.
But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich.
Margaret Thatcher there at her last outing at the Dispatch box as Prime Minister, speaking to a rather younger Simon Hughes. But joining me now is the senior online editor of the New Statesman magazine, George Eaton, as well as my panel, Lord Goodman and Nigel Nelson. George, this is an interesting element of Labour's manifesto. Not many people have picked it up, but it does perhaps suggest that Keir Starmer is not exactly Tony Blair.
Yes, I've called him a quiet radical, and because Labour's campaign strategy has been to appear impeccably moderate, but by any measure, the manifesto is to the left, not just of New Labour, but of the manifesto Ed Miliband put forward in 2015. And you mentioned some of the policies there. You could add public ownership of rail, setting up a publicly owned energy company, GB Energy, and as you highlighted, enacting the socio-economic duty in the Equality Act, which gives public bodies a duty to address inequalities rising from class, occupation, place of residence. I think the reason they've been seen as cautious is because they've been so conservative in tax and spend. And that's because they know Labour has often lost elections because it hasn't been trusted on the economy. But behind that, there are radical proposals on Britain's economic institutions, actually precisely because they're being so cautious on tax and spend. If you want to change the economy, if you want to boost growth and reduce inequality, you're going to have to make changes elsewhere.
Of course, it's interesting. Perhaps it's easy to be quote-unquote conservative on tax and spend when tax and spend are at historic highs under the government that you're trying to defeat in an election. But I wonder, this particular inequality duty, it's going to make hay for lawyers, right? Whenever a local authority tries to do something, there'll be able to be a judicial review. Does this reduce inequality?
Well, I think we'll see what happens in practice. So it's already been enacted in Scotland, but you're right that I think Labour is in favour of more legislation, because that is one way that you deliver change. I think we've become used in recent years to governments which haven't been introducing lots of new legislation, partly because the Conservatives have been so immersed in factional warfare. But things such as the New Deal for Working People, that's a really ambitious, radical proposal on workers' rights that's going to lead to a lot of institutional change.
We're going to broaden this discussion out now because, Lord Goodman, in some ways, is this the inverse of the Conservative Party? The Labour Party is speaking from the centre and perhaps governing from the left, whereas the Conservative Party has been speaking from the right and governing from the centre.
One of the difficulties the Conservative Party had in this election is that it's gone from clearly representing some people a few years ago to then representing a lot of people at the time of Boris Johnson and the referendum to being, I think, rather confused in this election about who its core vote and the voters it's appealing to are. And I think George was quite right. And I've been following his stuff and I've read Labour's manifesto myself about how radical this proposal is. And my beef with it isn't the equality element as such. It's putting all this power into the hands of judges. Because it's the judges who will decide if you take a case to court, say about pay, under one of these categories. The judges will make the decision about the rights and wrongs of it. But who stands up here for the rights of the taxpayer? And I think that the competing rights of the taxpayer and the right of the person who's claiming should be fought out between democratically elected representatives in Parliament rather than become a matter of a judgment of the courts.
Nigel, isn't the case here that we have a leader of the Labour Party who's barely been an MP for much time? He's spent much more time as a senior lawyer.
Yeah, and I take Paul's point, but I don't think this is the intention of it. The whole idea of this is not about spending a lot of taxpayers' money. It's about how you serve, if you're a local authority, how you serve your residents. So it could be something on the lines of a local authority wants to close a couple of bus routes. What you would do is have the socio-economic duty is to check who's going to be impacted by that. So if, for instance, you're going to close the one where there's a load of elderly people without cars, that would be one worth saving. All it means is they're thinking about people's needs rather than just doing the whole thing arbitrarily.
On the other hand, more duties, more obligations. Isn't democracy supposed to arguably sort that out? George, I'm fascinated in how Keir Starmer stood to be leader of the Labour Party. Recently, I've been watching some of his original campaign videos where he's talking about all of the legal action he did for free on behalf of the miners. He fought legal action for those that refused to pay their poll tax. He took McDonald's to court over environmental reasons. All of this stuff. And then he's suddenly appearing very, very centrist now. Where's the truth? Which is the real Starmer?
So I think the truth lies somewhere in between. He has a strong attachment to social justice, strong attachment to human rights. He was a human rights lawyer, but he's not suddenly going to re-embrace the 10 pledges that he stood for on the leadership on. He's not going to support free movement. I don't think he's going to pushed for public ownership of Royal Mail and water. Well, water he may be forced to, but I don't think he's going to push for a radical increase in tax. But I think taxes will rise, and there are some on the Labour side who say yes, the tax take is at a record high for the UK, but it's still 4 points below Germany. It's 11 points below France. That gets us into the really big debate. What economic social model do we want? And I think sometimes, partly because the debate was dragged so far to the left during the Corbyn era, people sometimes forget that in between, say, the Conservatives at one end, Liz Truss at one end, and sort of Corbynite socialism at the other, there's quite a lot of space there. It's sort of social democracy, really. Yeah. And there's a big debate to be had about, are we going to see sort of tweaks to the Anglo-Saxon economic model, or are we going to, over the next decade, if Labour have a decade in power, which they might, become a country closer to that European social democratic norm? It's a big debate.
No, it's an absolutely fascinating point. Just because you're to the right of Corbyn, of course, doesn't mean that you're to the right or indeed in the centre ground at all. There's a huge, huge space in between. George Eaton, really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming in. And, of course, thank you to my panel as well. Now, after the break, we'll be speaking to a political betting expert in light of some of these gambling commission probes into Conservative candidates.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
History lecturers at the University of Liverpool have been advised to problematise whiteness and heterosexuality in their seminars. They are saying that you should be guilty if you're white and heterosexual. Not using the long words they use, but that's kind of what they're saying.
Yeah, but do you know what? History in this country is concerned with more and has been lived by more white people and more heterosexuals, right? And that's the history. I'll tell you something else, Dawn. This is Russell Group University material here. This is Liverpool. It's a really good university. The thing that really got me going apart from this, and I thought it was an AI generation of words input into a system to come up with from something. It's ridiculous. The main issue I have is the verb problematise. I've never heard of that before. So they should be prioritising grammar. Let's get first principles back in there firstly.
It's just promoting anti-racism.
It's not, Amy.
It is, wait. It's just bringing the marginalised voices into the discussion. So
no, what they're saying is look at British history through the optic of...
all perspectives. So let's look at it from the perspective of a queer person growing up. Let's look at it from the perspective of somebody from...
But that's not the majority.
When I actually looked at the evidence, it's all about unpacking bias. And you have to admit there has been a white bias in history.
No, there hasn't, because the facts...
From a white perspective...
Amy, the facts are, in history, most people in this country are white and heterosexual.
Of course, but then there's still...
So that's the history.
...voices that deserve to be brought into the discussion as much as the dominant...
Look,
like, that's all decolonising the curriculum is hearing all sides of the argument. Which surely we at GB News love. We celebrate that. That's what we do.
We do, but we're not telling anybody it's bad to be white or it's bad to be...
Exactly.
That is not what...
Amy, it is. It is.
Amy.
The People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. GB News, Britain's election channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. It's just gone 9:15. My name's Tom Harwood. Now, the Conservative Party have faced controversy in recent days after the Gambling Commission revealed they're investigating the possibility of two Conservative candidates placing bets on the date of the general election. One of the Prime Minister's protection officers is also under scrutiny. The offence of using inside information to gain an unfair advantage for financial gain has been called reprehensible by the Secretary of State, Michael Gove. But I'm joined now by William Kajani, the political betting analyst for Star Sports Bets, and my panel, journalist and Conservative peer Lord Goodman, and GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. William, we're going to start with you in the round. Political betting seems to be something that has grown in prominence in recent years.
It really has, yes, and we've had a lot of opportunities for that sort of thing. We've had the Brexit referendum, we've had political turmoil, we've also had a number of opportunities for sort of special markets. We were doing votes on, the Brexit legislation, and people were betting on that. So we've had tons of opportunities, and it really has grown over the last 10 years.
And of course, you've brought in your famous whiteboard, which includes some odds that people can get at home. Let's go through them. What's the Labour Party?
OK. So we will start with the Labour Party. Now, they are heavily odds-on to win this election. A landslide is predicted. We've had 3 RMRPs. They all have them winning a huge amount of seats. And the punters have decided that it's going to be more like Canada 93 than 97 and Tony Blair. So the 11 to 10 favourite in our seats market with Labour is for them to win 450 to 499 seats.
A huge majority.
It's an astonishing number. And it's just unprecedented, frankly, in election betting. We haven't seen anything like that.
And now you can get pretty decent odds on less than 100 seats for the Conservatives.
You can. Again, this is also unprecedented. In fact, the actual favourite in our more specific seats market is for the Tories to win between 50 and 99 seats, which is just incredible when you consider not only how dominant they were in 2019, but also the fact that, again, this isn't usually normal for the Tories at a general election. This is much, much worse than what John Major was facing.
And the Lib Dems, they're insurgent.
They are. The Lib Dems have been arguably the most popular party with the punters.
Really?
Yeah. We've been taking lots of money on Lib Dems to win various seats. In that blue wall, in the constituency betting which we've got, the Lib Dems are being backed to overturn Tory Bigbies. Now, everybody remembers the Portillo moment. This will be an election of the Portillo moment. Punters are backing them to overturn any amount of Tory seats, and we can see them having a very successful night.
Now, there's been a poll out today that says Reform is level pegging with the Tories, but there was that famous moment when YouGov had them 1 point ahead of the Tories. You can get odds on that.
Yes, and I believe Redfield and Wilton has also had a slight crossover. It's clear that the Reform surge is real in the polling now. There's no denying it. You're getting a situation where they're either within the margin of error or they are just narrowly ahead. And this looks set to go down to the wire. When we had this market up, I had to believe, honestly, I had to say I didn't really believe they'd actually do it, but it's gotten closer and closer. Nigel Farage stood the campaign's momentum and a lot of attention, and they're just 9-4 to win a bigger percentage of the vote.
Interesting stuff. Well, Nigel, of course, this is all fun and games, but there's a very serious point at the heart of this. What's been going on with these 2 Conservative candidates, of course, allegedly?
Allegedly. And I wish they'd tell us. That would seem to clear things up. We don't know. I mean, they are under suspicion of the betting equivalent of insider trading, basically. Now, we don't know that. They won't tell us what actually happened. We know that one of the candidates put on a £100 bet on a July election.
So we're not talking big money?
Well, we're not talking big money there. What we don't know is about the other people who've been involved, or indeed if there are more people involved. It just seems to me this couldn't be worse for Rishi Sunak. That everything that could go wrong in this election has, from being drenched when he announced it, from bunking off from D-Day, and now this, which, whether true or not, leaves the impression that Tories break the rules when they feel like it, but impose the rules on everybody else.
Lord Goodman, this seems very, very odd. Not just the fact that there is all of this question mark about what went on, but frankly, how this story came about.
Yes, there's a difference between someone just putting a harmless political bet on. I must say, I'm not a political punter myself, so I don't really understand quite why people think they can beat the bank, though some people do. There's a difference between that and, as you say, using insider information. Just if you put yourself for a second in the position of your kind of average, godforsaken, or so he would feel, Tory activist going around knocking on doors, you would feel these people had let you down very badly indeed. And I cannot see why they should not be suspended pending further inquiries.
Very, very interesting, because, Nigel, this, of course, is yet another, perhaps, self-inflicted error in the Conservative campaign. It's been a litany of errors.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that the rot starts with Partygate for the same kind of reason, because Number 10 decided not to obey rules that everybody else had to. We're in the same kind of ballpark with something like this. Gamblegate is all about now the fact that these people thought, oh, we can get away with this, no problem. If it turns out that they actually did do it.
I mean, Lord Goodman, could it be a big...
Suspend them.
Could it be a big coincidence?
This all does tend to come round in the political mix. I mean, I remember cash for questions going on when Labour were well into their term in government. The question is really what you do about it. And I think while someone's being investigated, there is no case not to suspend. And I think Rishi Sunak's going to have a very hard time answering questions this evening when he's asked what he shall do, and he'll doubtless say, well, you know, the Gambling Commission's looking at it. But I think he'll be very hard-pressed if he's then asked, what will you do then if these people are found to be in breach of the law?
Some question marks in terms of how this story has come into the public domain. Some people looking into the Gambling Commission itself, if there's a leak, if there's a leaker there, but that's a story for another day. Both to Nigel Nelson and to Lord Goodman, thank you very much for joining me, as well as William Kajali, and going through those odds. And please do, if you're interested in political betting, or indeed betting of any kind, remember to gamble responsibly. Thank you very much to my panel, and indeed to William. That's all from me this evening. Coming up next is the one and only Patrick Christys. Patrick, what's on the bill this evening?
Well, I've got a heck of a lot on, Tom, actually. A candidate has been caught on camera saying that women will burn in hell, we should keep them indoors, and it's funny if they feel the back of a man's hand. So we'll be talking about all of that and whether or not they should be standing at this election. Is mass immigration to blame for the housing crisis? Now, our reporter is in Tenerife as the hunt for missing Jay Slater continues. Has he been kidnapped? We're hearing from David Davis, Wes Streeting, and a Lib Dem as well. All go.
David Davis, Wes Streeting and a Lib Dem. That's the holy trinity of political conversation. Well, Patrick, look forward to it. Now, all it remains for me to say this evening is thank you very much for watching. I'll be back on your screens at midday tomorrow, but of course, Monday at 8 as well. And of course, it's the weather next, and it's sunny in Somerset.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office on GB News. Most places will have a fine start tomorrow. Plenty of sunshine, but a change on the way in the west as things start to cloud over with outbreaks of rain, courtesy of a couple of weather systems and a couple of areas of low pressure, pushing away the high pressure that's brought most of us a fine day today. Still very pleasant out there this evening. The main exception to that being Western Scotland, as the rain is trickling in here. Some of that rain could turn a bit heavy as we go through the night, but for most it's a dry night. Clear skies will allow a little bit of mist and fog to form and turn quite chilly over parts of eastern England, down to single figures for parts of East Anglia and the southeast, certainly in the countryside. So a coolish start here, but any mist and fog will soon disappear, and then generally it's going to be another fine day across the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast. Plenty of sunshine, soon starting to lift the temperatures, but a cloudier day for Wales and southwest England. Quite a cloudy start for Northern Ireland with some outbreaks of rain here, and a bit of a damp start in western Scotland as well. Much of northern England, much of eastern Scotland dry and fine, but a lot of cloud and some outbreaks of rain and drizzle over the Northern Isles too. It's further west though, where we've got this weather front moving in, bringing more in the way of persistent rain. That'll cloud things over across all of Northern Ireland by lunchtime, and patchy rain edging in here through the afternoon. Further rain to come at times across western Scotland. A few showers developing across Wales and southwest England too. Still some brightness possible here, but definitely the brightest, sunniest weather over central and eastern parts, and the warmest weather as well, 23, 24, whereas in the west it will feel a bit cooler than today because of the cloud and the rain. Leaving some showers around during Saturday over parts of eastern England. Another weather front coming into the northwest, but between, again, many places set fair on Saturday, a brighter day for Wales, and as we go through the weekend into the early part of next week in particular, it is going to get quite a bit warmer.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Don't miss out on your chance to win our Summer Spectacular. And have we got a prize for you? First, there's a totally tax-free £15,000 in cash to make your summer spectacular. Spend that extra cash however you like. You'll also win a brand new iPhone, Apple AirPods, and if that wasn't enough, a £500 voucher to spend at your favourite UK attraction, so you can enjoy amazing days out this year. For another chance to win the iPhone, treats, and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can also enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2, or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates.
You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
This is GB News and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but actually it's about you.
And we won't forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
More than ever, it's important to hear
all sides
as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got, in my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.